And Joe's that's when I met him.
Really?
He started working
Good.
on that.
And I so understand. I understand. You get on to something, you know how important it is, and you got to do it.
Yeah.
Just got to do it and see it through. I'm glad to be a part of it. No kidding.
And we, something had made me say, we've got to film Jerome's sisters now.
Oh yeah, the sisters.
Both died.
No, yeah, a wretched thing.
They were, in a way,
They
it's a
weren't even
blessing.
told he was going to be executed.
I know. One of them, a reporter called and said, "So, what do you think about your brother being executed?"
Oh my
That's it.
goodness.
And Josie, the older sister, and I'll never forget, she said, the phone went this way and I went that way.
Oh.
And,
We're all set.
Okay, let's go.
okay. So, your name and how you want to be identified.
I'm Sister Helen Prejean. I wrote the book Dead Man Walking after experiencing my first execution in Louisiana. I have since written The Death of Innocence, about accompanying 2 innocent people to execution, one of whom was Dobie Gillis Williams with an IQ of 65.
Okay. So, now you can say whatever you want to say.
I remember hearing about Jerome Bowden. It was in the middle of the 80s. I had been with a man, Patrick Saunier, who was executed in Louisiana in 1984, was on the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, and was learning about all the cases. And this is when we had that roaring wave of executions that was sweeping the country. What I heard about Jerome Bowden, and because I had worked with Millard Farmer, who tried to save the life of Patrick Saunier, the first man that I was with on death row in Louisiana, who told me about Jerome Bowden, and I got the story that when he actually sat in the electric chair, he thanked the people at the institution for taking such good care of him. I did not know then, that was in the 80s, that just a few years down the road, there would come into my life Dobie Gillis Williams, who's the first story in The Death of Innocence that I tell, who had an IQ of 65. And there's so many comparable things of his story, or any person that has mental challenges with an IQ of 65 and black. So you have this double whammy on you of being a black person in the Deep South, white victim killed, and you are hauled in by the police for questioning. Dobie's confession, when I finally got to see it and just saw how he had been coached into his answers. And people with mental challenges always want to get along with people. They depend on authorities. Their mama taking them to church, that was Dobie. His mother, trying to hold the family together and knowing that Dobie had special challenges, trying to hold him close. They depend on authorities. So when you're with the police, down in the police basement of the police station, dragged in at 11 o'clock in the morning till 6, and you give them what they want. You get tired, and then they give you, leading questions. That was present in Dobie's case. And I had never encountered a case where there was such actual innocence and the lack of forensic evidence. A white woman had been killed in this little town of Manny, Louisiana. Supposedly, she said in her dying words to her husband, who was never questioned, and the word was coming from within the community that he had been abusive at times to his wife, solely on his word, that her dying words were, "A black man killed me through the bathroom window." I mean, like actually giving the entrance. These are her dying words, and she's giving these clues. No forensic evidence. She was stabbed in the bathroom. There was blood all over the wall, all over everything. Dobie, the clothes he was wearing, there was not a speck of blood on him. And supposedly, he then stood on the toilet seat after the woman was dead, crumpled at the bottom of the toilet, and sprang from the toilet through a tiny window And when they took the crime pictures of the window, they made the window look huge. It was about as big as a microwave oven. Sprang through that window like some gymnast in the Olympics. Didn't touch the sides, didn't touch anything. No forensic evidence against him. And the most contrived narrative of how this murder happened I don't know that it could ever be beat. Supposedly, Dobie comes in through the bathroom window and just waits for somebody to appear. The lady, maybe it'd be the husband, who knows. And there was a steak knife on the back of the toilet. Supposedly it's, a steak knife. And then supposedly waited till Mrs. Nippers came through the door and then attacked her viciously and then escaped through the bathroom window. And there was no proof nothing was stolen. It was just so bizarre. And here's where you come to the importance of defense for people. Any poor person, especially a poor person of color, especially a poor person of color where there's a white victim, that defense lawyer is your oncologist when you have brain cancer. That defense lawyer stands between you and life and death. And Dobie sat by this lawyer who accepted $10,000 from the family, who scrabbled that together to pay him. And they actually got an African-American lawyer because they figured Dobie would have a better chance. But they needed a smart lawyer. They needed a dedicated lawyer. And Dobie sat by him when an all-white jury made up mostly of women became the jury of his peers. And he told me one story in it. He said he was picking these people. And I know there was one lady they put on the jury, and she was cutting her eyes at me. And I knew she wasn't going to be good. So I just said to him, I don't think she's going to be good for us. And he said, Dobie, trust me, she's going to be good for us. So the selection of that jury. And then you come to the ineptness again of the lawyer. Because he raised no formal objections to the seating of that jury, when it got to an appeals court, they said, you and your lawyer talked it over, and this was a strategy. You chose those people you felt they'd be the best for you. So Millard Farmer taught me this. Millard Farmer was the one I called in a panic when I had Patrick Saunier on death row in Louisiana. And I realized when I went to the Fifth Circuit and heard how inept the lawyer was, where even the Fifth Circuit, not known for their benevolence or kindness or fairness on death penalty cases, was saying to the lawyer, Pat, it would have been helpful, Mr. So-and-so, if you'd done this. And then I heard about this man, Millard Farmer. I called him up in Atlanta, hit him like a fire hose. Mr. Farmer, I'm Sister Helen Prejean. I'm the spiritual advisor of this man, Patrick Saunier. I think they're going to kill him. I don't know anything about the death penalty, Mr. Farmer, but you got to help us. Please, can you help us? Can you take this case? And then came those welcome words on the other end of that phone call. Sister, we're going to help you. We're going to help you. Then they drove all night from Atlanta to come and then take me to and I began to learn what dedication of criminal defense lawyers, those that take these cases. Whenever I sign a book for someone who's in criminal defense, especially public defenders, I always write to one of our true heroes. They go through social scorn. They're not invited to a lot of social cocktail parties.
Sorry, I want to interrupt, but there's a siren.
Siren.
Oh yeah, that's right. No, we got to do that.
Where do you want to start from? Where do you want to
I
start
could start with Colin Millard Farmer.
You sounded exactly like him.
I know. I'm going to help you. We're going to help you. I was just with him not long ago.
Another 5 seconds will be fine.
Okay.
Why don't you back up a sentence, if you could?
Which one? Back to Colin Millard Farmer or Bohr?
Oh, God, that's a good question.
Well, whenever you sign a book.
Well, that came after.
Yeah.
Well, you might, after you said he was going to help you.
That's after that. When he said, "We're going to help you?"
Mhm.
Yeah,
Okay.
I thought that's okay. Anytime.
And they drove all night from Atlanta to come to Louisiana and to drive to death row with me to see Patrick Saunier. I had never done this before. I didn't know how the criminal justice system worked. I thought it would be an absolute fluke if you could execute anybody innocent, or with all the appeals. I thought, don't we have the best court system in the world? So Millard became my teacher. And when I wrote Dead Man Walking, in chapter 4, Patrick Saunier is executed. And chapter 3, the chapter right before it, is Millard driving with me. And that's where he's teaching me about how race plays a part, how politics. He said the death penalty is 95% politics. It's 5% criminal justice. And so I began to learn. And then this man was executed. And after Pat Saunier's execution, I was not going back to death row. We had a training session in New Orleans for other spiritual advisors because I thought, I don't know anything about this. We need other people going in there. And Millard Farmer gave me 6 months to heal. He came over for lunch, and he said, Sister Helen, we got 2 more cases in Louisiana. It was Robert Lee Willie and Willie Selstein. And he said, they don't have anybody to be with them. And I looked in Millard's eyes, and I knew I was trying to save myself from the fire. And he was a man who was going back. And he said, you could be of help, be on our team, you could be their spiritual advisor, and you can help them have the dignity as they go through this, and hopefully they'll be alive at the end of it. And so it was he who got me going back and taking the next cases. So Jerome Bowden, when I heard this about this man who had an IQ of, 59, and hearing what happened to him. And then into my life comes Dobie Gillis Williams. And let's see, how long was I with Dobie? I guess about 7 or 8 years. And he was the sweetest guy. And when I would visit him, we had 2 hours for a visit. The first hour would be my pumping stories into him, telling him stuff happening, because it's so sensory deprived. You're in a cell. There's no stimulation of your mind. Telling him stories, drawing him out. What do you think of that, Dobie? And then by the second hour, then he would be forthcoming and really talk and share more. And when I found out about all that went on in his case and could see the similarities of what had happened to Jerome, then when you start moving into the system that allows this, and you get to the Atkins decision that happened in 2002, and Dobie was killed in 1999. If Atkins had happened, it took the Supreme Court of the United States that long to finally figure out, according to our own constitutional principles about no cruel punishment, that, well, maybe that was against human rights for mentally challenged people. It took them that long. If it had happened 4 years sooner, Dobie would be alive. And that's when I got into how ideology determines interpretation of words written on the page, the Eighth Amendment, cruel punishment, cruel, unusual punishment shall be forbidden. So how could a human being who had a good education, like Justice Scalia, who was so identified in his ideology with the terribleness of a crime that happened, and therefore the equation, therefore death is deserved, so that everything that happens in between, any kind of mitigating circumstances, he allows for none of it. It's just a simple, this is the crime, he's been found guilty in a court, and the assumption that it was a fair trial, and then upholding death. And then interpretation of law gets translated into policies and procedures. And so then all the decisions of the court that began to be made in the 80s, where any kind of mitigating circumstances were just cut down, pared down, like ineffectiveness of counsel. In the Strickland decision, they made it almost impossible to prove ineffectiveness of counsel, because you'd have to prove at the beginning of a trial while it was happening that precisely because of the ineffectiveness of the counsel was beyond a reasonable doubt the jury would have found him guilty. And you are talking about so many variables in these discussions or decisions of people whether or not a person deserves death or not. It became impossible. So like for 14 years, any of those appeals for ineffectiveness of counsel where you could show people were drunk, they were under drugs, where we actually had in the transcript a defense lawyer saying to the judge, I don't know anything about sentencing, I've never done this before, and you have the judge telling the lawyer, go to the library tonight, you bone up on this, and be here at 9 o'clock tomorrow. So what chance did they have? So I'm learning all this. I know nothing about it. But by the time I got to Adobe, I knew a little bit. I knew that when you go to trial, it's supposed to be a full-blown adversarial system of coming to truth. Prosecution presents, defense presents. But if you don't have defense like Dobie, no forensic testing independent to show the blood, there was no smudge even of him going through that small window. There was nothing to even physically place him at the place where the crime happened. And when that's lacking and the jury doesn't hear it, the jury makes decisions about, well, sure seems to be guilty. The prosecution held them all in that narrative, and there was no counter-narrative.
I'm going to stop you right there.
Yeah, another siren.
There was no counter-narrative. That's
Okay,
the
got
last
you,
phrase.
Joe. This is like New Orleans. Y'all got enough sirens like us. These poor D-pick people, y'all can breathe, cough, or sneeze right now. We got a break. I'm so glad to
There
tell
was
it.
one sentence you said, I wonder if you could say again, because you
Say
said
it.
guilty instead of not guilty. You said that it was about Strickland, that you have to show that the ineffectiveness of counsel would otherwise he would have been found not guilty. You said guilty, I think, unless I heard it wrong.
Okay, we'll say that again.
Just the one sentence about Strickland.
Last phrase, there was no counter-narrative.
Okay, but
Still rolling.
she's gonna say another.
Oh, got it.
Do
Okay,
one more
you do
sentence.
whatever
Okay,
is
thanks.
necessary.
Thank you.
Okay.
What the Strickland decision of the court made it almost impossible to prove ineffectiveness of counsel, because the criteria, the bar was that you would have to show definitively that it was precisely because of ineffectiveness of counsel that a jury looking at a case would not have found a person guilty. So for 14 years, any cases before the Supreme Court with that high bar, no one could prove or show ineffectiveness of counsel, even if the attorneys were drunk or ill-prepared or on dope or whatever. So the other, where are we going now? To the other place? Counter-narrative.
Give me a second here. Let me just see where this is.
Sure.
Constant silence. Do you need some? Oh, you got clean.
No, I don't.
Oh,
Hey, Joe, you got a Kleenex?
let me see.
Not with me now.
Is there some Kleenex here?
There must
Toilet paper?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Shall I just keep this here till we get?
Okay.
We're good here? We're rolling?
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, the counter. There's a saying among the lawyers that I've learned, the one who tells the whole story wins the case. So even when you do have guilt of a terrible crime, you have the mitigating circumstances. So we really have the development now of mitigating circumstances, which Dobie didn't have, and which his lawyer probably wouldn't even have seen the need of. And the one who tells the whole story wins the case. So you actually have the trial where you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt, where the bar's higher, with a good lawyer. That's easier to do than once you're sentenced to death and you move into that death track. To get the appeal in the courts is much, much harder. And Dobie really never had a case. I mean, Dobie really never had a chance, because when they got to the appeals lawyer, everything, there was just nothing there because it had been filed. Later, that lawyer was disbarred. Dobie,
Sorry, there's another.
That's, sorry, but that's just...
don't be sorry, because you're not responsible. I've been doing this war on people saying sorry for things they're not responsible for.
Okay. And by the way, I love that when you talk about the mitigating stuff, I'd love for you to address the question of whether you ever heard about one of these cases that didn't have a heartbreaking history.
Oh, yeah.
Because I haven't.
No.
I've learned a lot.
Mm-hmm.
We're good.
Yeah, okay.
Can we put that in now?
Yeah, sure.
And again, I learned this from Millard Farmer. Over 90% of all the people who are on death row were abused as children or had a terrible childhood. And so when you're going to find people guilty and claim them as being the worst of the worst murderers out of all the murders that happen in the United States, and you don't take into account mitigating circumstances. I mean, later, as I took more people on death row and I had more experience, I learned, like a case in Indiana where this young man, Jeremy Gross, they even had the video of him going in a convenience store, shooting the convenience store owner, and the guy being shot going, "Why, Jeremy, why? And you see the guy collapsing in blood there, and Jerome reaching in the cash register, grabbing the money, running out of the store. And a good defense lawyer, Bob Hill, it took 20 visits to the mother of Jeremy Gross to get her to come in that court and under oath testify that she had abused her child. That's a dedicated lawyer. And then he said to the jury when they came to the sentencing, "You saw Jeremy and the terrible thing he did when he walked into that convenience store. Now let me tell you the story of Jeremy Gross before he got to the door of that convenience store." And then he proceeded to tell the story how abused he had been by his family, how for a brief time, like 8 months, the state had taken him away from the abusive family, put him in a foster home. He played Little League baseball. His grades improved. He sat around a table with a family and had dinner together. And because Bob Hill had to show that this is a salvageable human being, like don't let him be killed. And that jury voted unanimously for life. Where here they had on video this savage killing of an innocent. That's what good defense does. Because when you look at fairness to juries, it would be sometimes they would send a note to a judge saying, if we don't give the death penalty, because they know they want to protect society, right? They've been told this person's so evil and bad they're going to kill again, we can't even send them to prison. They'd send a note, what will happen if we don't give the death penalty? And they wouldn't answer them. And now that they had to be given information that the alternative to death was truly going to be life-term imprisonment, the public could be safe. And juries started not handing down death sentences. So I came to feel for jurors. The more I got involved in these cases, here they are, just human beings like the rest of us, ordinary citizens, with this moral imperative on their shoulders to make a decision about a fellow human being and whether the fellow human being should live or die. And I tell the story in Death of Innocence about the anxious juror who knew when he looked at one of the inmates in Louisiana that he said he didn't look right. I knew he wasn't right. Robert Sawyer was his name.
Excuse me, there's
Well, we'll stop for
sign?
You know what this reminds me of?
Oh,
Doing a BBC interview outside of Angola prison.
oh,
It was outside. There's a gravel road, and trucks kept going by. It must have taken us 15 hours to do that interview. I mean, they kept going, should we make a decision? Should we change it?
Are you hearing the typing? Okay, good.
We're good.
Just here. All right, and I'm just going to check off things that you've already covered. This is good.
Ooh, gotta do my phone.
You've already done like, half the questions I had.
Yeah, because I want to talk about there's manipulation of the whole system from start to finish.
Yes, great, yeah, and so that's.
And I want to get
what
into
gets in the
Horace
way.
Kelly in California.
And that's about my question of what gets in the way of that
Yeah.
working. And as I said in the question, Jim Ellis seems to be really optimistic that now with the recent Florida and Texas decisions, now it's all going to be fine. Oh, Jim, you're so sweet.
No. No, the suffering's terrible.
Yeah.
It's just so terrible.
Think it's gone now?
Oh, yeah, we're
Okay.
good. Sorry.
Okay, all right, so we're back on.
When you look at just the theory of it, and what we say we have the best court system in the world, it looks like with all the constitutional rights a prisoner or person arrested has, you have a right to a jury appears, to confront, your witnesses, the people testifying against you. You have a right to due process. You have a right to equal justice under law. It all looks fair. But the more I've come to understand the death penalty, just moving right to the very top of the Supreme Court decision in 1976, Gregg v. Georgia, that put the death penalty back after only 4 years, where earlier they had found it unconstitutional because it was arbitrary and capricious. Supposedly they were going to set some guidelines that it wouldn't be being hit by lightning and that it would no longer be arbitrary and capricious. And so they said, it's only going to be reserved for the worst of the worst. Nobody really knew what that meant. So when states would put their statutes in place, Louisiana, Georgia, they just threw a bunch of adjectives at the crime. Well, it was heinous, it was premeditated, it was especially cruel. They throw a bunch of adjectives at it. But then the fundamental weakness was it was going to be left up to the decision of individual prosecutors to go for the death penalty or not. So you go with this very nebulous criteria, and then you put it in the hands of individuals. And when we look at the pattern of the death penalty across the board, we see deep South states that were former slave states responsible for over 75 to 80% of actual executions. So you have the actual practitioners always have been the deep South states. And it's up to these individual prosecutors who make a decision or not that they will go for death. And then we see the way they manipulate to use the death penalty to get confessions. Well, look, we won't give you the death penalty. Just tell us what happened to me, have your confession. And when you look at the confessions, especially of people who are vulnerable, and they're all alone with the police, there's a book written called 7 True Stories About False Confessions. It is really not that hard when you have that individual alone with questioners being intimidated to give them what they want. We learned this with the Central Park 5. Can I go home now? I gave you, the answer to the questions. Can I go back to my mother now? And they tell you anything to get those confessions. So there's this great guy, Dave Wymore in Colorado. when he was noticing the pattern of the death penalties in Colorado, noticed that it was in the rural areas out in the state, and prosecutors would make a decision and go. So they're in a microculture where the constituents there will be more prone to want the death penalty, so they get political leverage for going after the death penalty. And Dave Wymore set up what he called the A-team. And as soon as he heard a prosecutor was going to go for the death penalty, he would go himself with other members of his team and say to that prosecutor, "You do not have to go for the death penalty. You do not have to choose to go for death. Now I have the velvet glove and I have the iron glove. Velvet glove means you don't try to kill my client." And sometimes they say, "I'm not killing the client, I'm following the law," and this is, he said, the end of it is, he says, you can say you're not killing him. The end result is my client's going to be dead. Or if you go for if the velvet glove means you don't go for death, we'll collaborate with when my client's guilty, I'll collaborate with you, that you don't even have to go to trial to get a guilty plea because he is truly guilty. Just don't kill him. Iron glove is if you try to kill him, I'm going to get you at every step with pretrial motions. I'm going to find out when you lie. I'm going to find out when you hide evidence. We're going to get it out to the press. And you do not want to take on the iron glove. And they stopped the death penalty in its tracks in Colorado. They have 2 people on death row. There have been, I don't know how many attempts that have been defeated by prosecution, which just shows you when you have good defense what you can do. But to leave that discretion up to individuals, sometimes who are running or to be reelected, and we can see death penalties go up on election years of people. And you got to look at the microculture. In a deep South state where you have harsh penal punishments that have been going on for years, so a person in Georgia can be much more prone to go for the death penalty. And we look at the pattern across the United States of actual executions. That was rare in the Northeast and across the rest of the country. It was, why this pattern? So clearly you can see that you do not have equal justice under the law. And so we can see the pattern that it's rigged, that it's manipulated, and even the Supreme Court decision manipulated. And when you get to the ideology of the Supreme Court justices, which is very scary now, that people have been appointed to the court who are very hard-nosed about they're guilty of the crime, they should have the punishment. That when Atkins was being debated, Justice Antonin Scalia, who said, we got to go back to what the framers wanted. So you don't take into account what we know from psychology now. You don't take into account what we've learned about mental illness now. You don't take into account what it means to have a person mentally challenged and how that affects judgment. You didn't take into account then that you're a juvenile, that you're younger than 18, your brain's not even fully developed. What did the framers, how did they define idiots?
Okay, well,
We're silent.
So we got little built-in breathers. Look at this on the positive side.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. No, a lot goes into making this. I just so appreciate it. It takes a lot.
I wish you could see some of the footage that we've shot over the years. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
okay.
You could put it out on social media, the director's cut, after your documentary's done.
We'll put a trailer out
Yeah.
pretty soon.
Yeah,
right.
great.
We gotta start trying to raise
Yeah,
some
sure,
funds and-
sure.
And then we'll get you a copy of it, of course.
Oh, sure. So Scalia's argument was the framers define an idiot as someone who can't give the name of their parents or make change with currency. So he's taken that 18th century definition and trying to apply it. Now, what would make a person take such a rigid view of a criteria, which is as we develop as a society with psychiatry and what makes a person that rigid? And then there's the only thing that can explain that is an ideology. And there's another thing that I've been reflecting on a lot. When you're an elite, when you've gone to the best school, when you've had, like in the case of Justice Scalia, grandfather came in as an Italian to the country, worked hard, became a professor, and he gets the mentality anybody can do that. He does not take seriously what happens to people as a result of poverty and oppression and racism. He cannot get into that. He cannot empathize with that. It cuts him off. And I wrote in Death of Innocence that he cannot put his finger to the cheek and see the tears or to feel the pain. It's like he has on 3 sets of gloves and cannot be in touch with the cruelty or pain that is being caused by this. And one of the things that got me out on the road, one of the things that got me writing books about the death penalty, is I had been brought into the witness chamber and I saw with my own eyes what happened. I could see the cruelty. And in the book, I also name the guards that are participating and what happened to them. More and more is emerging that the people who have been the wardens and have been the guards to carry out the killing for us, those that carry out the killing for us are emerging with what we call either outright PTSD or moral hurt. And moral hurt had come from the war in Iraq, where you had these young soldiers there with the IEDs exploding, expecting to be killed on every side. And the story of one in particular, where he thought this person moving down the highway toward him was firing at him, and so opens fire and kills 2 teenagers on a motorcycle. That glint that they thought was fire coming from a gun was actually sun on the fender of the motorcycle. And now 2 dead kids that he has just killed. And he comes home, and how do you name it? They were naming PTSD, which they were acknowledging more and more. But it got the name of moral hurt. And so I tell the story of Major Cootie on death row in Louisiana, who called me in his office one day. It's okay. Take a breath. Do the Zen thing.
We're good.
All right.
He called me in his office. He had been through 5 executions. And I looked in his eyes and I knew he was a very troubled man. And he said, "Sister, I'm going to have to quit this job." He had been the supervisor on death row. And he served, kept order on the tier, make sure everybody got their meals. But then he was brought on to the execution squad, which they call the TAC team, the tactical team. Tactical meaning we use physical force to get the person to their death if they resist us. And he didn't even have to be there to drag people to the electric chair. But his job was solely to go in the cell after the person had been executed and collect their personal possessions in a paper sack to give to their family. And after 5 executions, he just said, "I come home at night, my wife knows not to talk to me. I just get in my lazy boy chair. I can't sleep, I can't eat, because in my gut, I know I helped kill a person who was defenseless." And when you look at the Geneva Conventions, even prisoners of war, you cannot have those that have been captured have their hands tied behind their back, placed against a wall and shot. It's that defenselessness. And so when you look at people like Jerome Bowden and you look at Dobie Gillis Williams, that defenselessness is not simply when they were strapped in the chair and then killed. That defenselessness was there from the beginning, even to participate in their own defense, to help the lawyer. That defenselessness is there when you're giving confessions that the police want you to give. The defenselessness is there from the beginning, which is what makes this so cruel. And the only way I know, when I came out of the execution chamber when Pat Saunier had been executed, I just finished writing a memoir called River of Fire, And the preface of it, here's the fire part of the book. It goes like this. They killed a man with fire one night. They strapped him in a wooden chair and pumped electricity through his body until he was dead. His killing was a legal act. No religious leaders protested the killing that night, but I was there. I saw it with my own eyes, and what I saw set my soul on fire, a fire that burns in me still. And now here's an account of how I came to be in the killing chamber that night. And it's about my own spiritual journey of waking up from being a good nun, didn't slap kids around, being charitable to people around me, praying that God would answer the suffering of the world, but rolling up my sleeves and getting involved and actually becoming engaged as a citizen and helping to and helping and getting engaged in resisting and laying bare the injustices so that it could change. And when I came out of that execution chamber, that first execution, it was the middle of the night, came out, and the first thing I did was throw up. I vomited. I'd never witnessed such a premeditated protocol of death. When we were doing the movie A Dead Man Walking, Susan Sarandon, the whole death house scene while we're waiting and counting down the hours, kept saying, this is so surreal. And that's the word for it. It's a ritualized, scripted death step by step with human beings involved in every step of the way to help it to happen. And there in the dark, having just vomited, I remember thinking very clearly, the American people are never going to get close to this. It's a secret ritual. They're not going to watch a Jerome Bowden being sat in the chair and saying thank you to all the people who took such good care of me. Were they ever to see that, they would know. They would know instantly that the death penalty is always cruelty. It's the torture of human beings, and it's always wrong. So I came out of the execution chamber as the witness, and I thought of the Holocaust Knight, who's the guy?
Oh, Elie Wiesel.
And I thought of Elie Wiesel, who said, those of us who have witnessed moral atrocities have a moral imperative to be that witness, to bring it to others. And I always believed that the American people were good. When Dead Man Walking came out in 93, fully 80% of Americans said they supported the death penalty. But I knew if you tell the story, like you're doing in this documentary about Jerome Bowden, that people's hearts are good and brought close to the reality of what's actually happening, they're going to resent. They will themselves shut down the death penalty, as we are beginning to see happen around the country today. But it can't happen soon enough. The suffering's so terrible. I'm with a man on death row in Louisiana now, Manuel Ortiz. He's going on 27 years. He's absolutely innocent. And what all the contrived stuff, the exculpatory evidence that was hidden, the lies that were told where his defense wasn't able to get the evidence from the prosecutor. And it goes on, and people are really suffering. Not to mention their families. Not to mention like the sisters of Jerome Bowden. Because once you posit that you can kill a human being and you can elicit the full powers of the state to do that, they didn't even call those sisters to alert them that their brother was going to be killed. And they get a news station calling, well, what do you think of the Jerome Bowden execution last night? I mean, any kind of cruelty and every kind of cruelty to families accompanies this thing where we allow the government to kill. And we got to stop it. And Jerome Bowden putting a face on the death penalty at its... Okay, what else do we need?
Well, you already have an interruption. If we're going to get over to Catholics mobilizing by 12:30, we need to leave in about 5
Okay. Yeah, it's 10 after 12.
Yeah. I don't know if
Okay,
that's-
Paul, what else do we
I
need?
don't know what to do. They,
Even if we're a little late for the lunch, it's important to get whatever you need.
thank you. I had thought we had you till 12:30, so, I would.
How am I going? 'Cause-
Rob was gonna drive all of us over, so 3 of us from DPEC are going.
Okay, do y'all mind going just a little bit late? It's a luncheon,
It's late,
and
yeah.
it's gonna last till 2. It's okay if we,
Yeah,
co-
I
okay.
think that's okay. I just wanted to kind of.
But thank you, we needed that.
And,
You're aware.
and Emma, just texted me the address that the luncheon's gonna be at, so if they need to go, I'm taking.
If y'all need to go, and then we could do a taxi or something. I have Lyft on my phone, we can do
Yeah,
Lyft.
I do too.
Okay.
I think it's probably okay if we're a few minutes late.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, let's go, Paula, let's see what
I
else
would-
we need.
Well, I would love for you to talk about what you said about Scalia's background, since he's dead now. We've got Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, you know,
Yeah.
and Thomas, and, you know, can you say something about, without naming them specifically, but just about the
Yeah.
justices who seem to be pro-death penalty, like what you said about Scalia, but as a more general.
Yeah,
Because I think
okay.
you're right, it's scary now.
No, okay.
Okay, and then, let's see, I'm gonna skip.
Okay, let's do that right now. I
Okay.
have that in my mind.
Okay.
And then if there's
Okay.
something.
We're good.
So in shutting down the death penalty, it looks like it's going to be more and more that we do it state by state, because we now have on the court more of the Scalia type that just say we're going to go by what the framers said. It's a safe position to protect ideology, because we could see, like, for example, what Justice Scalia did with the Atkins decision to use an 18th century dictionary to define idiocy, and so that you do not apply the evolving standards of decency that are happening in our society. And we have that ilk on the court now with new appointees that have gone on. So my hopes are, a lot of our hopes are dashed. There's not much hope that these people who are part of the elite of society, who went to the best schools, who've been resourced and privileged all their life, are going to be able to get into a kind of mindset or an openness like a Thurgood Marshall, who knew when he saw equal justice under the law from the experience of being a black man, of how tilted that is, and how we need people that can have that openness of soul to be able to interpret the Constitution in a way that fits our real situation in the United States today. That do it? Okay, what else we got?
That's fabulous, okay. Why shouldn't governments decide who lives and who dies? If you can incorporate.
Yeah. So why shouldn't governments be given the power to decide who lives and who dies? As Amnesty International has shown, whenever you give governments absolute power over life and death of their citizens, invariably, like a heat-seeking radar, whatever prejudices and biases are in that society are going to come out. How does it come out in the United States? Poor people who can't get a Cracker Jack defense, people especially who have killed white victims, 8 out of every 10 people chosen for death, the racism that is in the death penalty, and also just the geographical location of the microcosm, the microculture, where you'll have prosecutors with discretionary power much more prone to give out the death penalty. You can never trust governments to say that they're going to be able to select from all the murderers the truly evil ones in their character who did the worst of the worst murders, and then to be able to set up a system that will be able to set up a system that will never get an innocent person and will always get those that are deserving it the most. People don't even know what that means. We can never trust government with the absolute power over life and death. And my dialogue with the Catholic Church was that the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church has always been about that states had the right to protect society from dangerous and violent people. But then as we have prisons, and as we have a way to keep society safe without allowing the government to impose such an absolute decision on life and death. We have a way to defend society. And so in the dialogue with the Catholic people, first of all, but then every now and then you bump into a pope when you keep having the dialogue. So I bumped into two popes in the dialogue. One was Pope John Paul II, where I said to him in a letter, Your Holiness, I meet so many people. Is that a problem, Joe?
I would wait. Thank you.
Oh, wait.
We're good.
Ladder.
We're good. We're doing it.
I think I've just got, no. And I think I've just got one or two more questions, so we should be good.
It's all part of it. It's great that you're doing this documentary. It's important that you're doing it. It's okay. Breathe. You got to breathe.
Okay, let's do it.
All right.
So where to
Uh,
government?
yeah, it was about government having the power.
No, oh, Catholic Church.
Oh, yes, the Pope. Sorry, the Pope. Yes.
And so I asked the question of him. I said, I meet so many Catholics who say they're against abortion, but they're for the death penalty. How do you draw that bright line? Does the Catholic Church only uphold the dignity of innocent life? What about the guilty? And when I'm walking with a man to execution and he's strapped hand and foot, he has leg irons on, his hands are handcuffed to a belt around his waist so he can't move his hands. He's surrounded by 6 guards. And we're going to walk about 15 yards where he's going to be strapped down and killed. And I asked the Pope, I said, where is the dignity in killing a person who's been rendered defenseless? Can you help the Catholic Church stand for the dignity of all life, not just innocent life, but guilty life? And Pope John Paul II was the first to do that. And in St. Louis, for the first time, he put the death penalty with what Catholics call pro-life issues. He said no to abortion, no to euthanasia, no to physician-assisted suicide, and no to the death penalty, which is cruel. He acknowledged the torture in it. Our Supreme Court has yet to do that. It's cruel and unnecessary because we have a way to keep society safe. And then he added, even those among us who have done a terrible crime have a dignity that must not be taken from them. So he did a landmark moving of the needle in the Catholic Church. And then on August 2nd, 2018, finally, Pope Francis changed the teaching in the Catholic Catechism. It took 1,600 years. And one of my things is when you love people, when you love your country, when you love American citizens, when you love your church, when you love your family, you stay in the dialogue. If you have been a witness and you know something's wrong, you stay in the dialogue till finally you can bring it to the people and they get it.
Lovely. I got one more quick
Okay,
question.
let's do it.
You talked about how the better changes, the changes for the better, are going to have to come from the states. Maybe, is there anything else you'd like to say about what's it going to take? I mean, implicitly you've talked about a lot of
Yeah.
said a lot of things. Is there anything else
What's it
you'd
gonna
like to
take?
say about that? Yeah. What else can be done at any level or by anyone?
Well, always what we must do where there's one individual life that is about to be taken by the state, we must resist in every way we can. We must summon all the resources we can to go to defend that life, to try to preserve that life from being taken. So we educate the community. We summon and train and get good lawyers to be able to be there with them, especially to be there with them at the trial level, like they're doing in Colorado. Dave Wymore that set that in place. We do everything we can to save human life. We have to come to understand that people are worth more than their worst act. And the way they drummed up the death penalty, you know that by 76, people were made to be very, very, very afraid of these murderers who would get out and kill you, and we can never trust them to be put in prison. They'll kill guards, kill other inmates. The only thing we can do is this violent solution, as we see being applied like in immigration. We've been made to be so afraid of these people seeking asylum. They're presented as criminals and gang leaders and drug dealers, and we should be afraid of them. And therefore, it's okay to even separate children from parents at the border because these people are evil. So when you demonize a human being, when you absolutize them into being an evil person, that's when all these atrocities can happen. Later we look back and we just say, oh God, that was wrong. How did we do that? So those of us that are awake, and especially those of us who have been brought close and witnessing what this means, we must be very active. It's okay to get tired. It's okay. We got to do everything we can to awaken people while people are still alive. And we should not be killing individual citizens in this tortuous method where you take a conscious and imaginative human being, put them in a small cage for 15 or 20 years, and then give them the date of their death, and then go get them and walk them down the hall and kill them. Later, when we can awaken more, like the rest of the world, to human rights, we will recognize that we engaged in the torture and killing of our fellow citizens. We work toward that day. This documentary works toward that day of awakening hearts and minds, that people will be active. You'll be active in your state legislature. You'll be active in writing to people on death row, getting involved with families who are going through the suffering. And you'll also be active in helping victims' families be healed in a way that's real and is not dependent on waiting 15 or 20 years to be brought in and witness the violence of the state with the claim that that is going to heal you, as if it ever could. Anything else? Joe, you got anything?
That's beautiful.
You good? No, good, great. I'm so
There's
pleased to
nobody
be
like
able to
you,
do
Sue.
this.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. Okay, so
Are you guys wrapped up?
she's through.
Yeah.